even a potential military standoff. But get this, it's between allies. We're going to break down exactly how a fight over Greenland is pushing the entire NATO alliance right to the brink.
So picture this. You've got all these top diplomats from across the EU scrambling for an emergency meeting, and you'd think, okay, what's the crisis? But they're not there because of some big adversary. Nope. The threat they're discussing is coming from their closest ally, the United States. And the whole thing? It's all about Greenland.
So it just begs the question, right? Why on earth would Washington risk a massive, major fallout with its closest partners over, well, a giant island of ice? That is the big question we are digging into today.
Okay, so this whole thing kicked off with an ultimatum. And let me tell you, that's a word you almost never hear used between friendly nations, between allies.
So what was the ultimatum? Well, the US basically said to Denmark, sell us Greenland. This isn't a negotiation, it's a demand. And to really turn up the heat, they're threatening to slap tariffs on 8 other NATO allies, basically for daring to stick up for Denmark. I mean, you can imagine, this sent absolute shockwaves through Brussels and kicked off that emergency meeting we mentioned.
So how in the world does the US justify making such an aggressive play against its own team? Well, the official line? It all comes down to national security.
The thinking goes something like this. The Arctic is heating up, strategically speaking. And if a major rival, like Russia or China, managed to get a foothold in Greenland, the US would almost certainly get dragged into some future conflict. So the White House's argument is that the only surefire way to stop that from ever happening is to just own the place.
And this quote right here, it really sums up the whole philosophy: peace through strength. From their perspective, the only way to guarantee stability in the Arctic is to have absolute, undeniable control, no ambiguity.
But this is where it gets really serious. The White House has pointedly refused to rule out using military force. And that right there takes this from a heated diplomatic spat and turns it into a potential military crisis. We're going to get into what that means for NATO in just a second.
So, you can imagine, Europe wasn't just going to sit back and take this. How did they respond to all this pressure? Well, let's just say they were unified and they were not happy.
The reaction from Europe came back fast, and it was sharp. I mean, even Sweden, which isn't even in NATO, came out with this really blunt message: we will not be blackmailed. Simple as that. And then France jumped right in, echoing that exact same feeling, saying, hey, no amount of intimidation or threats is going to influence us. The message coming from all over the continent was basically one big, unified voice. Europe is not going to be pushed around. And this really tells you how serious they're taking this. This whole thing has been kicked all the way up to the top. The president of the European Council is actually calling an extraordinary meeting of all the European leaders. They're trying to form a totally united front here. Look, this is so much bigger than just a political disagreement. What the US is doing here, it's shaking the very foundations of NATO. And you got to remember, this is arguably the most successful military alliance in the history of the world. So at the absolute core of NATO, there's this thing called Article 5. It's the whole principle of collective defense. It basically says an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. And just to give you some context, this has only been used once in its entire history. And that was after 9/11, when all the NATO allies stood up to defend the United States.
And this brings us to the absolutely mind-bending paradox at the center of this whole crisis. If the US were to actually make a military move on Greenland, which, remember, is part of Denmark, a NATO member, it would theoretically trigger Article 5 against the United States. It's wild. It would literally mean NATO would be required to defend Denmark from an attack by its own most powerful member.
Okay, so let's circle back to that national security argument. How well does it actually hold up when you look at the facts? All right, so on one side, you have the administration's position. There's this urgent threat from Russia and China that makes Greenland essential. But then you look at what security experts and intelligence sources are saying. They point out that, for example, a Chinese warship hasn't been spotted anywhere near Greenland for about a decade. And, maybe most importantly, the US already has a major military base there. They even have a treaty that lets them expand it. So, the tools to protect the area are already there. And all of this leads to this just stunning conclusion from one security expert. It's a total role reversal. The one country that's supposed to be the main protector of security in the region is now being seen by some as the biggest threat.
So this whole standoff leaves us with a really tough, kind of unsettling question. What happens when the guardian of an alliance suddenly becomes its biggest threat? And what does that mean for the future of Western security in a world that just keeps getting more and more complicated?